how are you doing in terms of the lawsuits that you're getting involved in? What's coming down the pipeline?
A lot of suits probably to be filed this week and next. So the suit against the FDA with Bobby Kennedy concerning whether or not the emergency use authorization and any biologic license for a COVID-19 vaccine has met a proper legal scrutiny under the Administrative Procedures Act and constitutional rights at issue, given that it is being the FDA's approval, even under just emergency approval, is being used by governments, employers, and educational institutions in places of public accommodation to issue coercive mandates or segregation plans. And so that raises issues of whether or not their decisions have been what's called arbitrary and capricious, whether or not they followed the rule. The rule of reason is what's really supposed to happen, that's enforced by the rule of law that is supposed to be supervised by, with judicial oversight. And that just hasn't happened in our view. Now, for the details of any medical information related to this question or controversy, for that, people have to go to Viva, barneslaw.locals.com right there. That's where you can look up the various breakdowns of the fact sheets relating to the vaccine, to responses to the CDC and the Department of Justice's positions to date on the vaccine, and I'll be to prior lawsuits concerning the vaccine and whether emergency use authorization should have occurred, whether biologic licensing should occur, whether it should be limited by groups of people, by individual characteristics, whether that be age, whether that be comorbidities, whether that be particular health conditions, whether it's appropriate for it to ever be considered the kind of drug that should be mandated at all, any place, anywhere, anytime. Because so much of that concerns medical information and scientific information that YouTube does not allow to be discussed. They took on my small YouTube channel, they took down a video, struck it this week, that was from 16 months ago concerning just your legal rights concerning a lawsuit. And because any lawsuit's going to get into some of the medical disputes and controversies, they just struck it right away. And so for that reason, that's why all of that will be at vivabarneslaw.locals.com. All of the lawsuits that I'll be filing will also have links there. We can now at Locals upload PDFs. So there will be PDF uploads of the suits and complaints, all the ones that have been filed by others, the ones that have been filed by me. And yeah, they're coming. They're coming for firemen, for teachers, for cops, for workers. Tyson Foods might be sued with a very big class action coming soon in the next week or so, unless they correct their actions. Walt Disney, the Disney Corporation, is looking at, I'm looking at suing them, suing the cities of San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York. Taking action if necessary, if the military does in fact order it, against the Defense Department. And so, and then of course, challenging all of it altogether, particularly for children in certain younger age groups, but ultimately for everybody on the FDA challenge, because one of the big problems is the FDA has refused to announce what their standard is. It was like,
and their standard for ultimate approval, or their standard for interim emergency authorization use approval?
All of it. And what's their standard for determining safety? What's their standard for determining efficacy? What's their standard for determining necessity? What facts are they looking at? What facts do they consider relevant? How are they? What information do they consider pertinent? So, for example, is it a 1% risk? Is it a 5% risk? Is it a 10% risk? What's the risk of a severe adverse event from the vaccine? What's the percent for? And is that going to differentiate by group? So, for example, maybe for 16-year-olds, there's a whole different risk profile than there is for an 85-year-old. And shouldn't they know that? Shouldn't each one, and as part of the informed consent process, are they requiring fact sheets be given to people before they get the vaccine, which is supposed to be the informed consent enforcement process as part of the statute and the rules? Because we're hearing many people got the vaccine without knowing any of the information in the fact sheet, including some who were identified as being at risk under the vaccine fact sheet. So, I mean, every problem it is in looking at this so far by the FDA, every problem that you could imagine in the regulatory process. And this is, again, a case of legally what they look at is the process. They don't look at your conclusions. because they're not here to second guess your conclusions. They're here to see, did you go through the right process to get to those conclusions? Did you consider all relevant facts? Did you provide an opportunity for people to comment and then answer those comments in a citizen petition process? Did you apply reasoning? Did you apply any decision making as part of your process? Something that's not supposed to be considered, such as political pressure, things. All of those things. Did they? And this process is the worst process for the approval of a vaccine I have ever seen in the history of the FDA, and I've been studying it now for a long time, going back to the history of the FDA. So that gives you an idea. When you can't even tell people what your standard is for determining safety, what your standard is for determining efficacy, what your standard is for determining necessity, what your standard is for determining effectiveness of alternatives, what your standard is for giving informed consent, then we're dealing in a standardless environment that is completely contrary to the whole point of both the Administrative Procedures Act governing agencies and the constitutional provisions to govern our government.
You know, and Robert, I'm going to read this super chat, then I'm going to ask you a question. Barnes, is there anything I can do to help? I'll be a grunt. I'll do whatever is necessary. Deliver documents, processes. Thank you very much, Jasper Tones. But someone else said you look tired. I don't think you look tired at all. I think you look determined now, and especially when you start talking about this. But do explain for people who don't understand how you operate, because you're not a one-man show. And I don't think people appreciate the system that you have to take these lawsuits and to file them in various states and various jurisdictions. If you don't mind explaining.
Yeah, sure. So for anybody out there that either wants to help, wants to be local counsel, it'd be, I have about 25 states covered of local lawyers who are going to be assisting in these cases. We still need the other 25 covered, including Arkansas in particular at the moment. We got a lot of the big states covered. It's a lot of small states we still don't have. So it's local lawyers that all that will be asked of them is to be what's called pro hoc counsel. That in a state that I'm not licensed in, they agree to work with me so that I can work in that state and file suits in that state. Not much work, usually, not too much. And then anybody who wants to volunteer, anybody who has a potential case, go to the law firm website. There's a contact page at barneslawllp as in Peter.com. There's a contact page. Use that. I know a lot of people have been reaching out through other forums. And I do follow everybody at Locals, but on like Twitter and other social media, I don't have time to go through all of that. So if it goes through organized method through the contact page, that's organized. It's an automated system to make sure everybody gets it and the information is stored. And I know some people are wanting immediate responses. I will not be able to respond to everybody.
And people do. I get the messages from Locals, and so people saying there's a few questions that come up frequently. How do I find the template for the employer letter? That's on the pinned. That's on the pin board. I mean, you have to just ask anybody in the community.
Just go to vivabarneslaw.locals.com. At the top, it will be pinned an example of letters that have been successful for employees as to the vaccine mandate or as to religious objections to the vaccine mandate. Both are present, and many other people have utilized it to success. It's clearly this is a coordinated effort. The other terrifying thing is what was said to doctors in California is now spreading to even places like Arkansas. And it may be because big corporations are also putting pressure on state actors or getting the message out. But yeah, I have cases now where doctors have told their patients that because of their particular medical condition, they don't think they should take the vaccine. But the same doctor has told them they don't want to sign a medical exemption because they've been told they'll be put under immediate scrutiny by the state. So doctors are being intimidated into interfering with the patient-doctor relationship, which, by the way, is constitutionally protected, that patient-doctor relationship, to try to discourage the use of medical exemptions. And then several employers, like Tyson Foods, is deciding what religious beliefs it's okay for their employees to have. And so that if you have a pro-life belief and you're concerned about the vaccine because the vaccine, I won't get into the issues again. Go to vivabarneslaw.locals.com.
It involves
censoring information about that too.
It involves trace materials or materials from humans that are used in the development, research, or production. So I think we can leave it at that.
Precisely. And their employers are lying to people about that. They're saying that something is not was not done that in fact was done, and that I have all the medical evidence for, that the uncontroverted medical evidence. So but again, all of that, vivabarneslaw.locals.com, that'll be available. We'll be breaking down the suits as we file them. We'll break down some of the suits that have already been filed. There were suits filed this week, or anticipated to be filed this week, from the District of Columbia to Hawaii. Some of the Hawaiian union members or members of the board reached out to me. We had a discussion earlier this week, and they filed suit on Friday on behalf of 1,200 union members because it was also a violation of their union contract and agreement. It was the governor's just issuing edicts like these are 16th century. I guess he thinks the king is back in Hawaii and he can just start issuing orders. And so there's going to be a lot of challenges on a lot of grounds on all these vaccine mandate issues. The big one will be with Children's Health Defense and Bobby Kennedy challenging the license altogether, that the FDA has not followed the rules they're supposed to follow, has not adapted the information they were supposed to adapt to. They have not even answered basic questions and basic comments in the citizen petition filed many months ago by the Children's Health Defense. And again, this is extraordinary. No drug like this has been approved in this time frame without answering comments from major citizen petitions. There will be signed declarations by leading doctors across the world that will be part of that case. So that will be sort of the center case, but there'll be other cases challenging public accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act and conspiracy to commit battery. There'll be additional claims against employers under that, and potentially religious rights claims, because they're starting to what's supposed to happen is what's happening in the UK. You assert your religious exception, period. It's supposed to be no further investigation on that. That's been clear for quite a while. They're basically trying to remove people's ability, and this has been on the left for a couple of years now. There's been law review articles where they're like, we got to get rid of these religious objections, these conscientious objections. We can control medical exemptions by overruling doctors, which is what they're doing in New York. Big case pending before, likely to go up to the U.S. Supreme Court on whether or not the state of New York can interfere with a patient-doctor's relationship. Doctors have signed medical exemptions for kids, and some state bureaucrat who's not even a doctor is overruling them. These are the people who believe in science, but it's just garbage. So all these cases are going to be fought, and it's going to be one heck of a legal battle.
Robert, two questions that come up pretty frequently. Okay, so we know that the vaccine manufacturers were given immunity. We know that by and large, the government has sovereign immunity for that which they do in the course of their governance, to the extent it's not criminal. If an employer requires an employee to get vaccinated or to do anything medically, let's make it more abstract. If an employer requires an employee under these circumstances to get a procedure and the employee suffers some sort of damage, can the employer be held to compensate the employee?
It's an unknown question at the moment. What is clear is that employers are not covered under the immunity statute. So the immunity statute attaches to any vaccine maker, any vaccine marketer, any vaccine manufacturer, any vaccine administrator, any vaccine medical professional that gives advice concerning it. It does not apply to any employer or anyone else. It doesn't apply to places of public accommodation, doesn't apply to educational institutions, all of whom may be liable for any injuries suffered. And again, there have been, even as a proportion, I was checking into go to vivabarneslaw.locals.com for that data.
I'm getting the same question in Canada. My understanding is that in general, the general rule was yes, but under these circumstances, I don't see how that's going to be possible or even logical given the government's position on all of this, which is we're requiring it. Everyone's basically got immunity. And how then could you hold the employer responsible for something that the manufacturers themselves cannot be held responsible for the same damages? So I don't know how.
Historically, if you condition access to the service, particularly when they're overriding like medical exemptions, like some of them are trying to do, then you could really be liable because you went against the employee's doctor's advice and still required they be given that information. And in my view, if you even have a doctor that won't sign the medical exemption, you can say you have the medical exemption, you've received advice from a doctor, but they don't want to have a retaliation against them. And in my view, that's going to put a lot of employers are assuming everything they've watched on CNN is true. They assume that they have no risk from the vaccine having any adverse effects, and they assume they can only have upside. And they might want to research that data a little bit more because they might discover they're being stuck and left on the hook. And in particular, small and medium-sized businesses may not be able to absorb this.
I mean, it only fits into the existing, I won't call it a narrative, but the existing train of events that have been penalizing small to medium to small businesses since the beginning of this, but not the government, not big tech, and certainly not big pharma. The second question that comes up a lot is some people have been asking me, is it not breach of contract now to insist on this particular requirement, which might not have been provided for in the initial contract? To which I'm thinking it's either going to be force majeure or what are you going to do? Because how can an employer?
I think if you have a contract, you can absolutely bring a breach of contract suit because they're trying to unilaterally change and renegotiate the terms of the contract. And, they should have, they could have thought of this at the time when they did this. So they could claim that it's an emergency or something else and try to opt out of it. But, good luck with that. I mean, a lot of insurance companies lost on some of those claims related to COVID. So there they would have to meet the evidentiary standard. And my view is they wouldn't, because nobody so far that I've talked to in this context that's thinking about issuing the mandate has reviewed any of the science about this. They have no idea what they're doing. They're just assuming the New York Times couldn't possibly mislead them. They're in for a real shock when it comes to a real trial. And as an example, what they're really banking on is that the political prejudice of judges will keep them will protect them. And they may be right. There's plenty of people that are scared to take on these cases because they think it's too much of an uphill battle, too much of an underdog case. And so I understand why they think that way, because you have the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, and this is going to be a big issue. You have judges issuing vaccine mandates. How is a judge going to be impartially preside over a vaccine mandate case when his very ruling could make him liable for his own actions in the same context? This has never happened before, to my knowledge. This is totally unprecedented. You have a bunch of courts that cannot be impartial about this because they would implicate themselves because they're making the same mistake other governments and employers are making. And it's amazing. And they're totally accustomed to no pushback at all. I'll get randomly lectured by some random court that says, okay, we're going to do masks throughout the trial. Well, I'm going to start objecting. I mean, who knows what that looks like? I mean, does that impact the jury? We have no idea. We know it. It limits does it mislead them into thinking your client's, say, in a criminal case more guilty, or a defendant case more guilty because they're masked, because of the underlying unconscious association with masks? Who knows? Are you getting an impartial jury pool when you have all this paranoia about the pandemic? Judges haven't even thought about it. That they are such a tiny little echo chamber. They have not thought at all about their political prejudice, about their personal bias, and other things. And I'm going to be challenging all of it. So we'll see how it happens. But the challenge has to be made, no matter what the odds may be.
I don't know if you're following. Well, you do follow because it comes from my Twitter feed. But in Quebec, François Legault is unveiling the vaccine passport, rolling out the vaccine passport September 1st, and it's a vaccine passport. You're going to be a QR code on your phone. You go into a restaurant, they're going to scan you, make sure you're double vaxxed, fully vaxxed, whatever that term means. And you talk about it not going through any sort of public debate, any legislative process, any show us the evidence, let's have a discussion and ask the questions. And apparently, I haven't heard the exact quote, but it was quoted in CTV, which is government subsidized news. François Legault, the premier of Quebec, says that the reason why he doesn't want to go through the legislative process is he doesn't want Quebec citizens being exposed to misinformation or to conspiracy theories. And this is like, it is difficult not to get discouraged and not to get, however you feel about all these issues, not to get discouraged at the way the government and the way the courts and the way employers are taking this as to be effectively, it's a massive, I don't want to call it mass psychosis, but it's like everybody now is just panicking and going in the same direction without the second thought. And the people leading the charge have immunity, and everybody following, I guess, thinks that they're going to have the same immunity, both financial and moral, from what's going to happen or what might happen, or from what this is going to do to our constitutional rights. Um, but it's like it's the same thing in the States. We're just I think we might be a little ahead of the States in Canada. So you're looking into the future to some extent.
Yeah, I mean, it's an attempt to reinstate the fascism of the 1940s. The state and corporations have complete control over everything: your speech, your body, your autonomy, your freedom, your travel, you name it. And that's why it has to be fought back at every level possible, legally.
Is the FDA trying to rush approval of these jabs to this September in order to avoid all of the lawsuits?
Yes, they're trying to approve novel drugs using novel technologies for a novel virus that they have never been able to successfully use as vaccine for in American or world medical history. And I mean, again, average length of time for a drug vaccine to be approved as a drug to be approved as a vaccine is 12 years. In Jacobson, the Supreme Court, which was a eugenics decision, the foundation of the eugenics era, but even that court said it was critical that that smallpox vaccine had been approved of and used without problems for more than 100 years. This comes nowhere near that level of medical scrutiny. And the key has been big tech and big media and big government colluding to suppress information that could expose issues related to this. And that's why, that's the great utility of locals and why we created it in the first place, is precisely for issues like this. About half the country has no clue. They would fail a basic literacy test concerning COVID. They would fail a basic literacy test concerning this vaccine. They would fail a basic literacy test about how the process is supposed to work in the first place. And to Dershowitz's credit, who's a huge champion of the vaccine, he said that no vaccine should be mandated that doesn't go through legislative scrutiny first. And so he has stuck with what he told us during our debate with him. He said that, that yes, it has to meet the legislative process. Yes, it has to meet a certain high evidentiary standard, substantial risk of severe harm, and that evidence has to be tested both in the legislative process and in the courts of law. And this is a guy who's a huge vaccine champion. So that is what the law requires. The only question is, will our judges enforce
it? It's already one step too far when our politicians are not enforcing it. And TM reminds me, there was also the announcement for mandatory vaccines for planes and trains, plus federal departments. Don't forget that political parties are joining the bandwagon. This is another thing that I have to get off my chest. When the liberal governments and, the Democrats in the States, when pushing all of these plans, also purport to be, the party of tolerance, the not racist party. Just imagine that we know the demographics of who's getting vaccinated and who's not. It's even more pronounced in the States, but it follows a similar trend in Canada. You are now saying people who are not vaccinated cannot get on public transport. You're now saying basically it's going to affect disproportionately and disparately certain demographics. It's not going to affect the wealthiest of the wealthy who have their own methods of transport, who have their own private jets. It's not going to affect the government. It's going to affect already the most vulnerable, who have already been most highly impacted by this in Canada, and I suspect it's the same in the States. And it's predictable, and it's unavoidable, and it's coming from the very same parties who purport to be the champions of minority rights. It's hypocrisy of the worst order, but it's also just it's incompetent or worse governance that they know what's going to happen, but they cloak all of it in benevolence, and they're going to impose these vaccine passports that are going to have disparate effects on specific minority communities, and they know it, and they don't care, and nobody calls them out on it because they bought the media through government subsidies.
Well, that would be one of the subclasses, like against Tyson Foods, against City of New York, is that this is racial discrimination in violation of various either constitutional or statutory provisions, either federally or state or both, because this disproportionately impacts people of certain racial groups, and they can't justify it. The way I know some people don't like disparate impact interpretation of laws related to racial discrimination, but the reality is most people don't admit that they're racially discriminating. So disparate impact has always been a very effective way to root out racial stereotyping and racial prejudice and racial disparate effects that cannot be justified. They get the opportunity to say, okay, it has this disparate impact, but not only can that not be our motivation, we can show you it's not protectual by how business necessary our provision is. They get that opportunity. They just can't meet that standard here because they haven't even looked at the evidence themselves. That they have not done that at all. And this happens at even high-ranking executive levels. And I mean, people are looking at suit high-ranking lawyers and high-ranking law firms because the big law firms are trying to compel it on their other lawyers with even less justification and even fewer accommodations that are easily available for those people. Everybody that really what they assume is all the stakeholders agree. They assume their little echo. This is our first major test of what does massively censored media look like. When big tech colludes with big media, colludes with big government to suppress completely. I mean, there were little examples of that during the campaign, the Hunter Biden laptop issue, et cetera. But the COVID-19 issues, and especially around vaccines, that's the biggest and broadest use of big tech, big media, big government collusion to suppress adequate and honest information. I'm sure some judges, when they're going to be seeing the complaints that we're filing, despite their biases and prejudices that they come in with, are going to be shocked at some of the allegations and the sources of those allegations. That the sources of those allegations in many cases are federal government documents. That the sources of those allegations are peer-reviewed, published medical journals. That the source of those allegations are some of the leading doctors, and including in the vaccine context, in the world. They're not going to anticipate that because also they don't know their history. They don't know the history of repeated, 1950s, rush to polio vaccine led to massive number of deaths here in the United States. Another rush polio vaccine in Belgian Africa, in the Belgian Congo, late 1950s. Journalists attributed that to be the cause of the AIDS virus decades later. That's an example where you don't see the bad consequences maybe until 25 years after the fact. That's the risk with these things if they're not done right. 1976 swine flu, United States, rushed vaccine, total disaster, total debacle. We've had a bunch of those, more than people know, more than people realize. And because there's been complete media suppression of this information, so then people don't know what they should know and that they need to know. And that will be part of this process as well. Some of these, every case we bring is intended for both the court of law and the court of public opinion, because the court of public opinion is going to have a big influence on whether these laws and rules and restrictions go forward. By the way, you're on mute.
Yeah, it's exactly why certain social media tech giants block the discussion, any form of it, under the pretext of misinformation. It's exactly why our own premier of our province says he doesn't want to have the public debate because he doesn't want to expose people to misinformation. I was having a discussion with someone where I said, where I characterize what's going on here as tyranny and dictatorship. And someone says, well, that's a little exaggerated. And I said, what else would you describe a government passing what is effectively legislation without going through the legislative process? And they said, well, they were democratically elected in the first place. And I said, well, I hate to draw analogies, but so were a number of other dictators throughout the history of humankind were democratically elected in the first place, but abused of the system in order to stay in power indefinitely, and then started imposing rules without any legislative process. That is what it is. And like, it's as though because it can never be the same as it ever was in the past, that it can never be compared to it. And that's why Mark Twain said that history doesn't repeat, but it tends to rhyme. And we've got a lot of rhyming phrases now with what have come up in the past. And it's scary. I'm listening to you talk, Robert, and it's encouraging that you're going to take the lawsuits. I don't care if people disagree with you or people think that I don't know how anyone can disagree with certain principles here, which is proof, safety, efficacy. And when the FDA has had historical standards that they might just brush aside, it's a problem. I don't know how anyone can disagree with that. Whatever your positions are on other things, it looks like the system is being gamed right now in a way that discredits the institution that was there to protect the people. Okay, so I'm excited. We'll see what the lawsuits are, and we'll see if we can't talk about them here. Rumble and Locals have a union now, an unholy union, which might allow us to have these live streams on Locals the way we have them elsewhere.